Hello, my name is Mohammad Garipur.
And I'm Caitlin DeClerc.
We are the co-founders of the Epidemic Urbanism initiative, which is hosting today's session and which we will introduce in more detail in just a moment. Before we begin, a few notes of thanks. First, to our wonderful colleagues who have generously shared their time to be part of today's event, to the group of students who contributed thoughtful questions to guide today's discussion, and finally, to the community of more than 1,700 people from 91 countries who comprise the Epidemic Urbanism initiative. Before we introduce the panel, we would like to say a few words about the origins and ongoing work of the Epidemic Urbanism as a way to frame today's conversation. Almost 2 years ago to the date, institutions across the US began shuttering amidst the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. For many of us, work became remote, schools closed, conferences were postponed, we quarantined at home, and many of us only able to connect virtually. We entered an era of profound rethinking of the institutions, spaces, and places that frame daily life in seemingly unprecedented ways. Yet, at the same time, we were seeing play out in real time what historians had long been documenting: the vulnerability of urban settings to epidemic illnesses. In March 2020, we began planning what became our May 2020 symposium, Epidemic Urbanism: Reflections on History. We brought together academics from a range of disciplines, including architecture, history, medicine, and archaeology, to present case studies of epidemic illnesses from across the globe to demonstrate how cities throughout history have been not just a primary place of exposure and quarantine, but also the site and instrument of intervention. Two outcomes of this event were our edited volume and the founding of our Epidemic Urbanism initiative, which includes a network of regional liaisons from 74 plus countries. Basic values that guide our work in the initiative include recognition of our shared global vulnerability to epidemic illnesses. We believe that scholars in all fields need to be engaged in the discourse of epidemics and of health more broadly, and that we share a moral imperative to go beyond silos of disciplines and the academy. In other words, to collaborate. Essential to this spirit of collaboration is the need to share knowledge and resources across continents, as well as across disciplines. The Epidemic Urbanism initiative is committed to forging meaningful connections across the globe in service of this work. Despite medical advances, social inequities and thus risks and vulnerabilities have persisted over time, and we have yet to truly make the meaningful changes needed in our cities to address these fundamental drivers of health and health inequity. Epidemics expose the vulnerabilities of the societies they befall. However, despite centuries of outbreaks and interventions, we have yet to truly implement changes based on this lesson. This emphasis on equity has guided our work. For example, we invite you to see past conversations on our website, including the social equity panel in 2020 and the design competition in 2021, to name just two.
Hopefully this helps to frame a little bit today's session, learning from the pandemic, leveraging architectural education toward equity, health, and resilience. We hope that this session builds on these ideas by addressing a range of timely questions for architectural education provoked by the simultaneous epidemics of COVID-19, racism and racial inequity, and climate change. As mask mandates begin to wane, at least here in New York, there's been talk about a return to normal. Yet as we shift back to whatever this new normal looks like, we must not overlook the entrenched inequities and vulnerabilities that have been rendered all too visible over these last 2 years. In the spirit of EUI's commitment to meaningful change, this panel asks not only how architecture pedagogy has shifted in response to issues of access and equity in an online setting, but also more urgently, what might it look like if we take the lessons of the last 2 years seriously? For example, how might the practice of architecture need to change to confront the many precarities and vulnerabilities in urban settings rendered visible by COVID? And what role can and should schools of architecture play in this shift? We hope this conversation will illuminate key ideas to guide practice and highlight innovative strategies undertaken in participating institutions. We also wanted to let you know that we will be organizing a global discussion exploring similar themes on May 7th of this year, and we invite you to register for that session too. We'll happily send out a link with more information after this session. But for now, back to today's session. It's my sincere pleasure to introduce our panel chair, as well as our esteemed panelists who will represent a wide range of architectural schools from different geographies from west to east. We must emphasize that our selection of these wonderful panelists is not only due to their engagement in the discourse of architectural education the last decade, but also because they represent schools in both rural and urban areas, and they also support ranging cohorts of students due to varied institutional contexts and mandates. Today's discussion, as you know, will be moderated by Lynn Dearborn. Dr. Lynn Dearborn is professor of architecture at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where her teaching and research focuses on environment links to health, well-being, and social equity and resilience. As recent president and now immediate past president of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture, she has led an initiative to transform the organization's policies and procedures to grow more inclusive practices that work to counteract the systemic and historic structures of exclusion at the foundation of architecture's educational and professional models. Professor Dearborn will be joined by 5 panelists, and I'll kind of walk us through this poster here. Dr. Marianne Akers is the founding dean for the School of Architecture and Planning at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. As an academic administrator, she has led interdisciplinary teams of faculty, staff, and students who are strong advocates for diversity, inclusion, and educational equity. Together, they have accomplished outcomes because of their awareness and sensitivity to cultural and ethnic pluralism, as well as individual differences. She has significant experiences in applying high-impact strategies to ensure and enhance a nurturing environment for learning, student success, faculty development and growth, and research and scholarship excellence. Renee Y. Chow is professor of architecture and urban design at the University of California, Berkeley, as well as principal of Studio Urbis. She currently serves as the Dean of the College of Environmental Design. Her design and research address the metropolitan challenges of the 21st century, water scarcities, resource scarcity, and equitable places. To encode local conditions, Renee develops analytic and generative tools for integrating urban and architectural systems across sites and individual buildings. These practices can be found in her books, Suburban Space and Changing Chinese Cities. Dr. Nan Ellen, who I hope is able to join us, I think there were some technical difficulties earlier, it looks like she's here, is Dean of the College of Architecture and Planning at the University of Colorado, Denver, and holds a PhD in urban design from Columbia University. She has spearheaded the creation of vital and vibrant places, including Canalscape for Phoenix, the 9 Line for Salt Lake City, the Trinity Innovation Corridor for North Texas, and Eden for Denver. Her writings, including postmodern urbanism, integral urbanism, and good urbanism, have been translated into 13 languages. Standing in today for Dr. Harriet Harris, who was ill and could not be present, is Kilian Riano, the Assistant Dean of the Pratt Institute School of Architecture in Brooklyn, New York. Kilian is also the founder and lead designer of DSGN AGNC, I hope I'm saying all this right, a design studio exploring new forms of political design, processes, and engagements through architecture, urbanism, landscapes, and art. Kilian has over a decade of teaching experience and is an initiator and core member of Dark Matter University. Thank you so much for being here. And finally, Dr. Robert Weddle is professor of architecture and dean of the Hammond School of Architecture, Drury University. He holds an MArch from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and a PhD from Cornell University's History of Architecture and Urbanism program. Before coming to Drury in 1999, he taught at Bryn Mawr College in the Growth and Structure of Cities program and at the University of Illinois Study Abroad program in Versailles, France. Clearly, we are in for an excellent conversation today. Before I hand over the mic, I also wanted to acknowledge the students who convened earlier this month to discuss their own experiences of and goals for architectural education in the post-COVID age, and especially Andrew Bowie, who coordinated this effort. The questions generated through these discussions have inspired many of the directions for today's panel. So now I am very pleased to hand over the mic to you, Lynn.
Thank you, Caitlin. I was going to thank Andrew as well, because the really rich set of notes and thoughts that Andrew conveyed to me that came from these student conversations, were a really helpful reflection for me to think about a little bit. What have we learned from the pandemic? How might this change the way that we operate, or maybe it already has. And so that's what my questions for the panelists today are going to dip into. So without further ado, I'll pose the first question, which is the pandemic forced us really to discover and use new tools to communicate and teach. How are we, or can we use these tools to expand connections and collaborations as we move to our new normal? That's the first part. And can we use these tools to reduce the intense feelings of disconnection that students and faculty are experiencing as we transition from total disconnection to being together sometimes and not together at other times? So, and I will, Marianne's in the center of my panel, so I will go to Marianne first.
Well, thank you very much, Lynn. In terms of the new tools of communication, it has been an evolving process, actually, because when we had to go online immediately in 2020, we were not well versed in Zoom, neither did the students. But as we evolve, we have come to a certain point where we do have, other ways of communication. At my university, which is Morgan State, we are highly, highly encouraged to have what we call Morgan Flex, which is the students have a choice that day whether to go online, which is remote and synchronous, or face-to-face. We thought that students actually would come face-to-face. And this Morgan Flex only started in the fall because we had to technologically infuse all these new technology into the classrooms, and it took a while. And what was so interesting was students opted to actually stay at home or wherever they were, to go virtually than face-to-face. And so that's what we're grappling with. But other ways of communication that I have learned from either faculty or other students is the discussion. There are ways, strategies to ensure that discussions are not hoarded by only certain students. And so the strategy of the round robin, you say one thing, you say next, so that there are no dominant speakers. That's just some of the learning and engagement strategies that I have learned throughout the 2 years.
Thank you. Bob, you want to chime in at all?
Sure. So I think our experience might be a little different than the other schools represented here, because we essentially returned to in-person in the fall of 2020. And our context is part of the reason for that. We're a program that many students opt for after possibly considering things like online education. Not so much in the architecture major, but elsewhere in the university. So we have a large student body that is really committed to not doing online work. we also had the ability, I think, early in the pandemic, our area was sort of less affected perhaps than more urbanized areas. That caught up with us, of course. But early in the pandemic, we had the ability, I think, to be flexible, and we had the ability here within our facility to sort of widely disperse studio workspaces. And so pretty early on, online tools became ways for us to actually connect students who perhaps were isolating, or for whatever reason had difficulties coming in and physically joining their classmates in studios. So the approach that we use with those tools tends to be one that I think is actually connective rather than disconnective in most cases. And I've certainly seen a whole range of reactions and abilities to kind of juggle those technologies among students and faculty. And so, for example, in a classroom-sized gathering on Zoom, I think most people agree that it feels quite distancing for everyone involved. Whereas for doing small-scale critiques, sort of replacing desk crits with Zoom interaction, I think many people feel that actually has a kind of directness and even intimacy that is difficult sometimes to achieve in the studio setting. So one of the approaches that we took once we decided that we were going to have to be in person was to think of the studio as workspace and not teaching space as much. We sort of left the studios over to the students and created different, like we used parts of our building that are never studio spaces. Those suddenly became studio spaces. We designated other critique spaces throughout the building where students would come and discuss work with faculty rather than faculty directly going into the studio. And I think all of that created maybe interesting and perhaps different dynamics than what is typical in larger universities.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to go to Killian, and then we'll go back to the West Coast to Renee.
Hi, thanks so much, Lynn. I've had a few experiences with some of these tools. Before the pandemic, I actually had taught a couple of courses on Zoom at Parsons in programs that were created because Parsons has many design kind of disciplines and programs, not just architecture. And in those, sometimes we would have students from all over the world. And then the Zoom became helpful. That was a good training because as the world transitioned, and I remember when Zoom was kind of one of many options. We don't even talk about Skype anymore, for example. It's kind of interesting to think about the things that have gone by the wayside as the pandemic moved on, and we all kind of concentrated on a couple of these tools. Miro boards, as well as I know that other places have used Figma and other tools. There's been a couple of things that have been interesting. And I also, as I was mentioned in my bio, participate in a collective called Dark Matter University that used this particular moment to advantage, to create a national network, to be able to teach at 2 universities at the same time, to bring together students through these tools. What I can tell you is that, that what I have seen is that people in our case seem to want to be coming back to the school, that now we're beginning to deal with how do we use these tools in order moving forward. I don't think these tools are going to go away, yet there might be secondary, tertiary. Hybridity is very complicated because it creates the problem. However, what I see now at reviews is the technology to bring 1 or 2 reviewers in Zoom to a physical presentation is no longer about lifting up the laptop, and you see it's a lot more. I feel like some of the flexibilities that this is going to create are going to be very helpful. In our case, I've heard of students at Pratt that, especially from international backgrounds, where they created mini networks, whether I think it was in China, maybe Taiwan and Hong Kong, where some of the students actually came together and had their own little pods of work. So it allowed to create new ways of people coming together, even within the pandemic. And the mural boards have been a very helpful tool, I think, for us to pin up, work together, collaborate in schools where I have seen Figma used. Figma is basically a Google Doc. For people that may not have seen it, probably a lot of you have, but it's basically like a Google Doc of working with something like an Illustrator. So you can literally build and work together and layer a drawing in real time. You can collaborate sometimes a little bit better than you could even in physical space. However, having said all that, I think that everyone misses the tactile, misses the conversations that we're having. So I think that these tools are going to continue to be used. Right now, for example, we're still having a lot of our events on Zoom. We're having and now hybridity. We're also having some of the spaces online. In one case, maybe that shows about how things might move forward. We opened an exhibition on models and model making through our faculty, especially looking at some of the work that they may have done during the pandemic, et cetera. Because of the Omicron wave, we couldn't open that exhibition to the public widely. Yet there was a deep spatial scan that was created and placed online that allows you to walk through, look at, interact in some ways with that physical exhibition that I think shows the potential of these things to become ever more present, meaning a virtual experience that is not secondary. And like I said, I think that another thing that I saw was having faculty from all over the country teach. It really opened up that diversity in all kinds of ways within our faculty groups, spatial, city, as has been said. And I thought that that was an overall good thing that happened. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Renee, then Nan will come to you on the first question.
Thank you, Lynn, and hello to colleagues and hello to the participants. It's nice to see a lot of names that I know. I would say there are a couple of things that we tried that I think, one of which will have a long-term benefit, and then I'll talk a little bit more about my fears. Like Killian, I think the whiteboard was one of the things that, well, we all learned to use Zoom, maybe to exhaustion at this point. The whiteboard was really transformative. One, for equity reasons, our students had to plot all the time, and the costs in plotting, at least for us, started to make an uneven playing field for students who could plot more versus less. And then once our students plotted, they didn't want us to draw on top of them. And I don't know, Trace seems to have disappeared from the studio. So the whiteboard allowed instructors and students to interact in a way where you could draw on it, you could save it, but you weren't damaging the original piece of work. And so suddenly the dialogue became much more dynamic. And I think that that's really been positive. And I hope that that gets maintained. One of the things that I feared most when the pandemic first hit was the loss of the informal learning that happens not when the instructor is with the student, but when the students are with each other and they can see each other's work. So we had a colleague who set up a virtual environment, literally a model of our design studios. And we wanted our students to post their work up there so that they could walk around. They could even post models up there. And then unlike an analog model, you could pick these virtual models up and walk through them in a way that you couldn't. What happened was our students were so exhausted learning new technologies that the virtual environment, which is really well developed now, nobody wanted to learn how to do it. So that was a little bit of a disappointment. I will have to say that in watching everyone come back, so we came back in person fall of 21. So we had a year that was entirely remote. I'm actually beginning to see what we lost in that year when we went remote. And I'm very much pushing back against the campus inclination to say, oh, we can teach more students if we move remotely. I think particularly for our undergraduates, where this is an opportunity for them to work, study, learn side by side with people from different backgrounds than themselves, you can't do that when everyone's a rectangle next to you. And so, undergraduate education is really the chance when you get to move outside of the cultures and practices that you had growing up and to learn about others. And I just don't think we can replace that in a remote educational setting. Field observations, all those things we couldn't do in a remote education. So I'm pushing back hard against a campus that kind of saying, oh, can't we just offer more courses remotely? I'm saying no.
Yes, well, first I apologize for the technical difficulties. Never happened before, but there's some construction on my building right now. So if I fade in and out, I apologize. I think zooming out a little bit from what was just said about some specific technologies, I would say that there are things we have gained over the last 2 years, and there are things that we have lost. And from the very beginning of the pandemic, and then with the tragic murder of George Floyd and other racially based incidents, there was a strong feeling, I think, among so many of us that there's something we needed to learn. There were things we needed to learn. And this centrifugal force of the pandemic, forcing us out of the public realm and into our private realm, has given us this incredible pause. And I've been very strongly saying to people in my college from the beginning that we're not going to go back to normal because the normal wasn't so good. This is an opportunity for us to go forward. And so we've been, working on that. And one of the things we did during this period, which is, everybody did this, was we developed a JEDI strategic plan, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And it's given us a lot of time, and I know this is further in the discussion, it's given us a lot of time to reflect on what wasn't working and to address these issues. Now, we've worked a lot on strategic planning and we've implemented some of the things, but it's a work in progress and we've got a lot more to do. But I think what we've gained is this incredible pause that we could not have done without the pandemic. For all its trials and tribulations, it did give us that opportunity to reflect and to look at things very differently. And so that's, I think, what we've gained, but it is very much a work in progress and we're continuing to move in these other directions.
Thank you, Nan. And I'm going to go to you first on the next one as kind of a follow-up. So as a major disruption to business as usual in education, architecture, and society, has the pandemic expanded the possible professional paths available to students beyond those historically and traditionally seen as the professional architectural norm? And if so, in what ways have professional and other potential roles expanded? So maybe that pause that you were speaking of, the ability to reflect, has had other things occur to you in that realm?
Again, I'll zoom out a little bit. And if we look beyond architecture, everybody's been reflecting. We've had the Great Resignation. I was in a room 2 nights ago of hundreds of real estate developers, and they opened the session to try to have some icebreaker questions. And the first question was, so how many of you have changed jobs in the last year? Just year. They didn't even say 2 years. About 80% of the room raised their hand. So what we're seeing because of this great disruption is everybody, not only architects, not only our students in our fields, but everybody think about, hey, what do I really want to be doing? Who do I really want to be doing it with? What's the appropriate work-life balance? All these things we didn't even ask ourselves before because we were on remote, right? And that's what the centrifugal force, it was a force of the pandemic, forced us to do, is to rethink many things. So yes, anecdotally, we've been hearing of both students who thought they were destined along a certain path, taking different paths. And we've heard of many, many people in the profession deciding to do something, either we all know they're practicing differently. We all know about that. But actually choose different paths. We hear anecdotally about that as well.
Okay, thank you, Nan. I'm gonna go back just reverse order. So Renee, I'm gonna ask you, but I guess for me also, have we done things that encourage that or nurture these ideas that, yeah, maybe what I thought I wanted to be isn't necessarily what I want to be, but I like a lot of what I do, right? I like those pieces. So in what ways are we providing guidance or support for that? You know, there's a at least at Illinois a large inertia toward the profession, and there's an abnormality for those students who say, you know, I actually don't really want to do that. I like this field, but I don't want to do what I see other people doing. So I don't know. That's so I appreciate, Nan, that, yeah, this is kind of like we're in the midst of this, but in what ways are we or could we do more to guide students or normalize alternatives for students?
I think, Lynn, what I would pick up on all of that, the change that I see in the last 2 years around all the crises Nan just pointed out is a real urgency about the need to make change. We really don't have a long timeline ahead of us. And yet in our college, we have the 3 professional disciplines. They shift so slowly, and our students really think that it takes too long. I mean, by the time we get accreditation to change, I mean, they still don't even have urbanism as a subject matter for architectural accreditation, which for me is just appalling. And so, you know, if we're going to make cultural change and we can't shift our professions, it means we're trying to find more nimble ways in which our students can also frame new strategic directions. My predecessor, Vishan, cleverly moved our multidisciplinary programs all into a new sort of column in our college. And what I'm trying to do with that is to make those students see themselves as designers of strategic initiatives rather than designers of the formal environment. We'll see how that goes. I mean, it's almost too early to tell whether anything will happen, but this is the shift we've taken and the emphasis that I'd like to put in to see if we can't make change happen sooner.
Thank you. Killian, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that we're beginning to see a lot of these changes, and it's quite honestly hitting students, hitting faculty, hitting administration. I think that, as Nan was saying, that everything from the racial reckoning and now it's backlash that is being felt differently in different states, to the great resignation is really, like we were saying, forcing us all to ask a lot of fundamental questions. I think one of the things that has been really happening here within Pratt and really with the leadership of Dean Harris has been to have the different programs come together more, to have more interdisciplinary projects, to have more conversations that begin to focus on the large issues we're facing. And I think that this is one of the things that we are seeing a shift on. Instead of focusing on this my disciplinary output, so this is the only thing I can do, and these are the constraints, but rather looking at big issues and with all the folks on the table, what are the different things that can be thought about in that way? So, and I think it has been done through things like student prizes. I think that one of the things that it has been, for example, we have a student prize on social justice work, to try to help the students and the faculty to incentivize a reimagining of the processes from within with the existing faculty, existing processes. But what about if we add this other kind of element to it? Something else is fellowships. We are, so for example, as undergraduate architecture is beginning to do more and more community engagement. We have two fellows, Sarah Capos and Ifoma Ebo, working with them, doing critiques, doing lectures, to talk about these issues. So how to bring in expertise that is desired, but that may not be the first thing that the people that have been teaching, for example, a studio may have. How to bring that in and have it be a collaboration and conversation. We also are starting a landscape architecture department, and one of the things that is doing is bringing together a lot of the programs that have to deal with urban landscapes as a way to have a larger conversation around them. So urban design, architecture, the planning departments, all together to talk about what this new program is. And now that we have an academic director in Rosetta Elkin, what the future of it is within the issues of New York. So I think that one of the things that we've been trying to focus on is how to create structural ways of allowing this to happen. And the last thing I'll mention is that also Lynn, you began by giving students the recognition for having come up with a lot of this even framing and conversations. And I think finding new ways for student leadership is really important. We started a program of the student assistant to the dean, which is a person that talks to us at the dean's office weekly, or in our case two. Actually, we have a graduate and undergraduate this year, and that has a role of helping communicate and have conversations around what are the things that are of most importance to students, and allowing us to respond, to have conversations, or for them themselves to just organize and just request. And in the case, for example, of lectures, the Pratt Futures group just takes a chunk of our lecture series budget and uses it as they see fit.
Thank you. Bob.
Yeah, reflecting a bit on Lynn's comment about the inertia that leads students sort of towards practice, almost like inevitably once they take the first step of enrolling in an architecture program. The rare student will change course, and we want to try to make opportunities and sort of recognition of those opportunities for those students. But I'm also interested in all those other students who are drawn, along this kind of path into practice and what that is for them. And one of the things I've observed is not so much graduates asking what can I do instead of architecture, but what can I do as well as along with working in an office. I've noticed this idea that the pandemic has sort of both collapsed us into our spaces and also extended our reach in some ways. I've seen young graduates become involved with leadership initiatives nationally or with advocacy in ways that I think before were highly dependent on maybe support from their office, the ability to travel, time off, the money to travel. All of that made it very difficult for a young graduate to find their way into some sort of national conversation. And so I've been really impressed with some of the ways that I've seen people kind of leverage this collapsing of the distances to get in on those conversations. And I think for many people that becomes a way to expand their world beyond the inevitable, which is the work in the practice. And similarly, we try to use that we've always really tried to make students aware of career paths that are available to them, mostly by bringing in lectures, people from around the country or internationally who can talk about different practice models. That is so immensely easier now. And we actually have alumni, in distant places that are examples of this, and we never really were able to engage those people, on the level that we would like to. And that's one of the things that has just become really common, actually, to do lunch meetings with students in which graduates share their experience. And so that ability, I think that mentorship potential has really expanded, especially for a program like ours, which is in the middle of the country, and there's a growing kind of practice culture here, but and we certainly have many graduates who go to St. Louis and Kansas City and Chicago and Denver. But now the ability to kind of, for a small school like ours, to kind of expand the network and make that network more cohesive, I think it's had a real benefit for our students just in opening their eyes to possibilities for them.
Thank you.
Well, in the case of Morgan State, I have observed in my 14 years as dean that students usually come to architecture with the traditional trajectory in mind. When they start their program, and I notice that this usually occurs about their third or fourth year, they start questioning, do I really want to be in a firm? And so with that said, I have noticed that students are very interested in real estate. Now, not your typical real estate financial type of program, but rather, and we will soon establish a community-based real estate, because they feel that they have not really, especially after George Floyd, they have not been I would say, tied or connected to urban neighborhoods. Many of them come from these neighborhoods, but many also come from the suburbs. And so community-based real estate is something they're really interested in. Revitalization could be a bad or good word, but they want to make sure that revitalization or gentrification really benefits the community. I also noticed students at that, third, fourth year are starting to see maybe not a firm, but I would want to be in a construction company. And so we do have construction management, and they're more interested in that. But I usually advise them, why don't you finish your architecture degree? Now, this architecture degree is not an accredited program. We are accredited in the master's. So this was supposed to be a feeder program. It's architecture and environmental design. Finish that first, because having a good architecture foundation will really help you in your career. Many of our students want to end up in nonprofit organizations that really make a difference in urban neighborhoods. So we will be starting the IPAL program this coming fall, because we feel that in order for that, they have to get licensure in order to benefit the community. Two other things: climate justice, big, big, big. Our students feel that there's not enough advocacy in the curriculum. That, well, first of all, our curriculum seems, even if we are an HBCU, is still very Eurocentric. We are changing significantly in that regard. However, the advocacy is where they feel that they're not doing enough for their communities. One last thing, for educational equity, we also notice that students do want to teach. They do want to go up in the higher ed ladder. So we have, and research, particularly evidence-based research. They're big on that. So we will be starting also in the fall a PhD in architecture, urbanism, and the built environment. Again, talk about educational equity. We need our students of color to have those PhDs if they do want to go up the career ladder in higher ed and to do research. So that's where we are when it comes to other professional paths.
Thank you. And I think that gives our listeners, our audience, a good sense of the different ways that different types of schools are taking on these, I wouldn't say challenges, but a new reflection on what is needed in the world that our profession perhaps is slow in addressing. So thank you. And Marianne, I'm going to come to you with the next question. It's kind of a long intro for this one, but so architecture has and remains notorious for encouraging, often romanticizing overwork and unhealthy work-life balance that favors those with more resources, cultural capital, and in particular cis white males. The pandemic forced the world to face tremendous health vulnerabilities and our lack of preparation to deal with them. Early in the pandemic, schools seemed to step back from their historic indifference to student care and make adjustments that encourage respect for mental health, self-care, and well-being. In the past 12 months, we seem to have replaced empathy and respect for students and faculty health with a return to the hard line of only the tough survive and excel in architecture. What will it take to refocus programs and educators on encouraging skills, strategies, and work patterns that lead to a healthier work-life balance for students and faculty? So we'll start with that. And if anyone wants to
just chime in,
move over to the how do we change that mythology that pervades our field as well, because I think we get it from many directions, and it's another one of these things that seem somewhat inevitable. And perhaps it is not.
Mm-hmm. I think this pandemic, as Nan said, we had pause, right? We had to pause. And I noticed and I observed that when faculty experience depression, experience isolation, they experience what the students are experiencing, they tend to be more compassionate with the students. And so with that said, we at the university, we do have an extension of our counseling center. However, I think in the School of Architecture and Planning, it is critical that we have these services right here in our midst. Although, yeah, e-counseling is very common, but it really would, since students are kind of back in person, the one-on-one with another human being where they can just download all their feelings, I think is very important. And I think I believe our faculty are being more flexible and more compassionate with our students, because they themselves, and that's often in the conversation, we talk about student mental health, but we rarely talk about faculty mental health. And I hear this from other administrators, well, that's a job, they should do their job. But faculty are also human beings. And so I think that's very, very important. I know Dr. Gary Poor has, before even the pandemic, had spaces here in our building where they had mindfulness sessions. Things like this that we can do in situ is very important.
In the College of Architecture and Planning here at the University of Colorado, Denver, I've observed some major paradigm shifts amongst the faculty over the last few years. And one of them is and partly it's because of the pandemic, and partly it's because of something else that happened at the same time, which is that we did a lot of hiring. So our faculty are younger and more diverse. And so one of the paradigm shifts is from the old fashioned, we're faculty, we know best, as opposed to the listening to the students. It used to be, really, do you think the students know better? And so why would we listen to the students? But now there's much more, a lot of openness to listening, willingness to listen to what the students have to say and to learn from them. A second one is the old school hazing approach, right? The first day of school coming in and saying, well, 20% of you will graduate, that kind of approach. The shift from that to, we want you all to succeed. And we are here. A part of our job as faculty is to support you in thriving and succeeding in your way. And the third is back to your question, Lynn, is to get there. Is it 24/7? Is it pulling all-nighters? Not at all, because that's not what they're hearing from the students. And there's a respect now for people who have jobs, have families, the work-life balance. And so we have, just to get more specific now, we've closed our building from 1 to 6 a.m. It used to be open 24/7, and we actually do a sweep at 1 a.m. to make sure students aren't there. We've closed the building. We have faculty who actually work with their students to map out the hours that now we're really clear on the hours that are required for a studio. We never were before. Before it was as many hours as you can put in. Now we say a studio is 30 hours. That's 10 hours in the classroom and 20 hours outside the classroom. And some faculty actually have their students map it out on their calendars. When are you going to do that work to help them not work too much, not work too little, but to support them in that. So there's some, we see some cultural shifts happening amongst the faculty that are having some real specific impacts on on pedagogy, also on curriculum, and also on modality. So what we teach and how we teach.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if anyone else wants to chime in. I also have, maybe we can do one or two more on this, and then I have several questions from the audience that they would like us to get to.
If you don't mind, I just think that this another collective I've been a part of is the Architecture Lobby that has been trying to bring up and talk about these issues for a long time. I've worked with Peggy Deemer for many years and doing some of these work, and as well as now the whole collective that is working. Incredibly important issue. I think that talking to our students and having students, faculty, and everyone understand about the value of what we do, shifting that is incredibly important, not only for the educational project, but for their careers generally. I think it also is incredibly, like I think Nan has already mentioned, an important equity issue around families and around who can afford to have to be a teacher, who can afford to go to school, given that, and making more flexible options. Making sure that any any task that we put out there has a very clear kind of compensated labor expectation to it. And if we are noticing that it's not matching, reimagining that project with students, making sure that, for example, requests for coffee machines to like stay up later, that, like maybe we can do something else instead. We want you to succeed. We want you to work hard, obviously, but the goal is not that kind of. I think the word hazing is a really interesting and good one that is seen, but rather that the hard work can be looked at in a different way and in a contextual manner. I think that it goes at all levels, as has been mentioned, especially in schools like ours that don't have such a big full-time faculty in the ratio, and where the part-time faculty is bigger. These things also become important, making sure that we are mindful of the overall portfolio of things that people are being asked to juggle.
Thank you. And one more,
Yeah.
yeah. Go ahead.
To build on what Nan said, my new architecture chair, Lisa Iwamoto, has mapped when assignments are due for all courses for every cohort. So instead of throwing it on the students to try to manage their time, there are two sides. One is to help the student plan so that they recognize they should be doing a little bit of design each day. But she's going to say blocks of time where studio design projects might be due versus when exams might be due, so that there's a clearer sequencing of that, and even what time of the week, so that faculty can work within that framework and know that that the students aren't ending up with 1 week where everything is due, and then, another month later, everything is due. So we can help them as well, and not put the burden all on the students. The other thing we're trying to do is a lot of this kind of mythology that sits about the all-nighter typically sits within the design studio, because it is iterative, it is problem defining, and you can sit there forever. And then there was glory in the fact that you pulled the all-nighter. And so we're trying to be very explicit about students, again, taking the mythology away of, somehow you're a creative genius and you're sitting in the studio waiting for something to hit you, and trying to explicitly talk about design as a process, design as distributed amongst a collaborative team, and how you manage the design process. And then students have, I think, an easier time of understanding where they are and why it is sometimes they're stuck and not.
Very good, thank you. I'm now going to turn to a few questions that we have from our audience. The first one, according to what you need to be an architectural solution, let's see, according to you, need to be architectural solutions of post-COVID era in planning educational institutes for deep improvement, interaction and interface in the classroom and in the frames of educational process generally. So I think the question is, what is it that we need in the classrooms, in studios, following our disruption, to really, I guess, enliven the classroom that maybe we lost, as we were speaking of earlier on, that the connections between students, the informal learning, have schools or programs been doing things that try to, I guess, bring back that informal learning, or those student interactions that maybe we lost by not having some downtime when students are just together socializing.
Maybe I'll jump in on this one, because I think it relates to what was just being discussed, especially in terms of collaborative work. One of the things I often think about is the way that sort of, that all-nighter culture, I think, was really driven by a part of studio culture that extends all the way back to the Beaux-Arts Atelier, which was all about a kind of collaboration that focused on socialization and a sort of, accomplishment that could be measured in terms of competitions and things of that sort. And if we try to strip away that aspect of studio culture, that sort of competitive aspect of studio culture, and look at what is there that we would really prize, that we would, hold up to our colleagues in other fields and say, this is a sort of education that can have a certain magic to it. what would those things be? And I often think it's that sort of soft collaboration, sort of informal learning that happens between students. And I've seen cases in our own school where we're trying to translate that into a more sort of formalized approach to collaborative education. I find that students often are frustrated by collaborative assignments. And one of the ways those used to happen is as a sort of preface to the design work. So before you really get going on a studio project, there's this period of research or some sort of collaborative exercise in which students are working together. And that was sometimes seen as a, just sort of a preface. Then I'm going to model this isolated genius designer. But to bring those collaborative exercises into the design process, I think is the real challenge. And when you do that, I feel like students understand its value better. They connect it better to the ways they're going to work after school, and they have to work with other people and sort of understand other people's points of view and expertises and processes. And so I think we've generally, as a discipline, not been very good at teaching that. And so I feel like a product of the pandemic may be that we look more closely at studio culture, studio traditions, figure out sort of what there is to keep there, if anything. And I'm convinced that one of those things might be a sort of healthier approach to understanding how other people work and working with other people.
Yeah, I think that as Bob was saying, one of the things we've learned is the importance of community and therefore the value of building community. And as Marianne was saying, we've also learned the importance of compassion and giving ourselves and others grace. And I don't think we've boomeranged back in the last 12 months. I think we've gotten stronger and stronger at that. And so one of the other shifts that's happened, and I alluded to some other shifts just before, but I think another shift that we're seeing is a movement in that line between the professional and the personal. So, right, so we still have things that we consider personal that we keep private, but that shifted. So during the last 2 years, we all got to know each other's pets and children and family. And so that's something we wouldn't normally have done. So we've kind of moved that line. And I think that's been really good because some of those things we considered personal and now we share become part of what informs what we do as designers, right? So we start to think about those considerations. We bring other factors into the decision-making processes now. So I think that as the professional and personal have converged to some extent over the last 2 years, we consider more factors as we work and as we teach and what we teach students to do and include as they consider how to make decisions regarding design. And I think that's been a really good thing. I mean, we even, talk about other forms of art like music. A lot of our studios created playlists and then shared the playlist just to like break up the tedium and have some fun. But then they started to think, oh, wait, music and architecture have something to do with each other. So I think it's cracked some things open that were tightly bound in a good way.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to chime in on that? Those were, in some ways, that kind of got to my next question. So, and those were from Shmaluel. I'm not sure exactly how to say the individual's name. I'm actually going to go then to the question from Anthony Waco. So, and this is kind of, I think, a little bit different question, which follows on the last question that we were discussing. But did you encounter situations where you either had to slow or lower the pass mark during the pandemic or promote students to a next level and are now facing students maybe that aren't as well prepared as they might have been in the past, because I know at the University of Illinois we there was a directive which was particularly in the spring of 2020, which was if students get to 2/3 of what you expect, that's everybody should be pleased with that. But then that kind of has this rolling effect of then they get to the next level and somehow that what's missing has to be made up. So I think strategies for how maybe changing expectations have been incorporated into some of these conversations that we've been having about even empathy and care and understanding. Has it caused anyone or any group to rethink what that bar looks like, or did we have a bar that really was I don't say unrealistic, but maybe not really, in some cases maybe felt a little bit arbitrary when we got to what we were really engaging.
In our case, I guess one of the things we're thinking about, so we definitely had that situation where, especially the class that was around their second year in spring of 20, which is a really critical moment, that's sort of moving from fundamental design issues to some more technical kind of skill-based abilities. We've definitely seen members of that class struggle. At the same time, I feel like there's a certain advantage that they have had in terms of sort of internalizing some of the technologies that are available to us, the communicative technologies that we've been discussing earlier on. So I think there are skills that class actually obtained just through their position within the pandemic as students. But one of the things we're wondering about is what the new NAB kind of processes are going to mean in this regard, because I really think this idea that we have to get students to a certain place, is we always think that that's the profession or that's NAB that is setting those bars for us, but it's also very internal. It's faculty who have expectations that maybe reflect who they were as students or who their professors were. And so I think thinking about whether those are authentic or valuable, sort of standards or cultural standards, I think is an important question. And I think NAB can play a big role. They've potentially given us the ability to be much more self-determining about what our goals are, but I don't know if any of you can share whether you have seen that happening, but I think it's still it's still an open question as to whether flexibility in determination of standards is really going to be coming to us or not. I mean, on the one hand, NAB has sort of removed a lot of their direct oversight of student work, but at the same time, they've positioned it into a couple of really critical studios, probably for most programs, or one studio. And so we may just be sort of repositioning the problem to some extent.
And I was actually going to follow up there's a question from Shannon Clark, which says, I'd like to hear from the deans in regard to Renee's comment from earlier about the lack of urbanism incorporated into, it says architectural discourse, but it is explicitly or obviously lacking from the 2020 NAB conditions. And I will say, as someone who was in the room when those were being discussed, it was discussed a number of times and it was put forward as a critical thing. I think, why does Renee find urbanism important, and do other deans agree or disagree? Should architecture and urbanism go hand in hand or remain separated? And I see the comment from June. Yes, June and I were part of that crusade to try to get urbanism back into the mix there. But
Yeah, no, and I had a similar thought as Robert, that in reality, that the promise of the NAB work that apparently you did, and some of you involved in here, is exactly that, and that now every school is going to be able to talk about what that urbanism means for them, and it's going to take probably a little while for people to get used to what this means and what it means to create your own benchmarks. We've actually lately been, although our business now for a little while, we've been having some conversations already. I found the NAB leadership so incredibly helpful and open to these discussions. That is really helping us also, and I think as was talked about earlier, to think about how we talk about this with and create processes with faculty, and the and the potential importance being a school that I think like some of these that have urbanism and architecture in this under our larger rubric. I think it's incredibly important. I am an architect that actually had never really had any urban training, official urban training, but I have been mostly teaching urban design and I taught urban design for urban planners here at Pratt for many years as well, because I don't see that as the big of a distinction. I think that those two things, and even quite honestly, interiors, I think that I always think that in New York City, to be a designer is to think interiors, urbanism. Those two things are skills that are actually incredibly tight. And within that and outside of that, architecture and all those exist. So hopefully, I was just wanted to echo that I think it's important to think about what those next steps are. It sounds like it's going to be a very collective process to bring that into the curriculum. And that many of the large-scale questions that we've been talking about, the systematic ones, are urban issues, are scalar ones. So whether, and I think that those are becoming both things that the students are more interested to deal with their design backgrounds, and at all levels, but that those might have to be spatial, so urban design or even planning, but there might be other ways of getting at those larger scales as well through the work that we do.
Yeah, as an urbanist myself, I see this in two ways. And I appreciate the efforts of June and Renee and anyone else who tried to, get it into the NAB criteria. But I think you can look at it two ways. On the one hand, architecture has had a history of mission creep. We're going to do urbanism, we're going to do interiors, we're going to do real estate development. And all those things are certainly related and certainly important, but it could be too much, right, to include in one student's education and in one set of criteria for accreditation. So maybe it's right to not include it, but instead give our students, and Renee referred to this earlier, how you have this place for interdisciplinary activity. And when I first came here 4 years ago and did all the focus groups with the students, that was their first request. Every single group, not just architecture, planning, landscape, real estate, interiors, everybody said, we want more opportunity to craft our own program according to what they want, even things outside the college, like maybe computer science or graphic design, right? So not putting it in the accreditation criteria, not requiring it in the curriculum for architecture students could allow them more ability to craft their own program. Maybe they want some sustainability, maybe they want justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, maybe they want adaptive reuse and historic preservation. They also, not only can they do what they want to do and what they're passionate about, they can also distinguish themselves in the marketplace by crafting their own interdisciplinary program. So they choose one, in this case, we're talking about architecture, but then they can add on in terms of electives, the other things they want to do. It might be urbanism, but it might be something else. It might be interior design or real estate development or historic preservation. So not putting it in the accreditation could allow that kind of flexibility for each student to craft their own program of study.
Yeah,
in our case, well, I'm a planner, and so urbanism, and a sociologist, urbanism goes decades back, in the 60s, where when you talk about urbanism, you're talking about lived experiences of people in their built environment or natural environment. However, I think in architecture and particularly architecture, the meaning of urbanism could be very nebulous. People, what is that? They ask. In fact, when we crafted our PhD in architecture, urbanism, and built environments, I did ask several of my advisors, architecture advisors. I asked them, what do you think about this term, urbanism? And they go, what is that? And are they gonna get a job with urbanism as a as a program? But that's neither here nor there. It's there, it's approved. And so with that said, one thing that I would like to advance in our discussion and moving forward, when we talk about urbanism, let's talk about people. People, and oftentimes we designers and planners think we know people, but we only know people from a certain perspective or certain angle. My sort of encouragement is, my goodness, let us collaborate with the social workers. They know about people. They know about collective voice. The sociologists, the health people. I mean, we really need to break those silos at the university to indeed make urbanism a really meaningful and deep area of study.
Okay. Thank you all. I'm going to go to one more question from the audience, and then I want to go back to our last question. So this comes from Wade Bark. In your opinion, what are the main lessons learned that we need our students to understand in architecture and design for designing in the post-pandemic era? Like, what are the morals that we need to take from architecture school as a result of reflecting on what we've been through in the past 2 years? And what I think from my perspective as someone who's very involved in architecture and environment and health is, what we've learned a lot of things about mental and physical health with respect to design, just as a result of people being quarantined or being sequestered, and what the home environment might do for us versus what public space might do for us, and how we create healthier public spaces even. So hearing from all of you on that would be great.
Well, clearly the inequities just got more and more clearly defined for us. If I felt fortunate that I had a home that I could be at. It had good air. I have access to outside. I could walk. And then I recognized there are a whole set of other people who did not have that at all. And so I think it makes us recognize that as we go forward in designing the environment, it needs to be more porous, it needs to be more passive, and it needs to be more equitable. And we have to teach our students, who will then move into the profession, how to do this.
I want to echo that, and I think that the post-COVID one, there's so much, like, I think in the future when we look at the post-COVID moment, it's going to include everything from the racial reckoning that we keep coming back to potentially even the current war, the current kind of level of censorship that we're beginning to experience. There's now tons of things that are being wrapped up at both social, political, and health moment, at least not to be too US-centric, although all of us teach in the US, but that's going to shape this experience. And I think that one of the things, and I think that what Marianne and what Lynn, what a lot of us have been talking about is really the blurring of the boundaries of the disciplines is going to be a really interesting thing to see, because there's both real possibility and optimism in that, but there's also fear and potentially even backlash against that. What does it mean to be a disciplinarian practitioner? Do we go in? Do we go out? What is and those are sets of questions, perhaps not even binaries, but there are things that we're going to have to go through. I think that that's going to really affect the classroom itself. And I think also that the classroom may begin to look a little bit more virtual. Other ways of learning maybe will come into it. Maybe we're gonna think about some of the classes that we've thought about and taught in one way for a long time, and find new ways in which to bring people in which to potentially create more different relationships between the faculty and the student and among students. So I wonder, one of the things that I wonder, quite honestly, being new to administration, is also the role of administrative processes in this. You know, how to deal with a moment of transformation, not only for architecture, which is, but as a society-wide moment in which everyone is asking similar questions. I've been in pedagogy. I was in the CAA, for example, with architects, artists, graphic designers, asking these very questions and how pedagogy should shift, how classrooms should look like moving forward. So understanding also that maybe other fields and other groups are having similar questions and how we can learn from them is something that me being new to administration, I'm very mindful of and thinking about.
Yeah, I think we've been learning a lot about two things we were already doing before, but I think we've learned a lot more about them in the last 2 years. And another way to say blurring, when we talk about blurring of disciplinary boundaries, blurring of professional and personal, blurring of the classroom and real life. Another way to say blurring is integration. We're integrating. In ways that we used to divide, we're integrating. And when we use the word integration, we often think of social integration. And that's a very important part of the integration that we're talking about right now. And so I think that the two big things, and they're related, are integration of things that used to be separated, including the integration of not just social integration, but functional integration, live, work, play, educate, recreate, all of that. Things that got separated during the modern era, we're now integrating. That's part of what was the problem. It was that we had segregated so much in our city and socially, so functionally and socially. So I think what we're really thinking about a lot now, we could look at integration as a means to an end, with the end being impact. Impact was something, sure, we always talked about impact, but I think it's risen in its importance. And students, you know, Quillian, as you were saying, they're interested in advocacy now. And that's not seen as a separate thing they do on the side, which we used to say, we're like, okay, if you want to be an advocate, that's fine, but that's something you do on the side. That's not part of your profession, right? All of that now we're saying, because we care about impact, that's part of what we do, advocacy, or work with nonprofits, or work with public agencies. We have a motto that we had before the pandemic, but it's taken on greater resonance, I think. Our motto is real people plus real projects equals real difference. So we're real people, down to earth, authentic, have integrity, working on real projects. And if we do those two, we make a real difference.
And I think we also have to help our students understand the opportunity that they're confronting now. That is, I think, a unique opportunity maybe in our lifetimes as well, that there's a receptiveness to design the issues out for a long time as a profession that often are not fully understood by either the so-called general public, or even some of the professionals that really drive the industry or the industrial model of architecture. But now I think there's an awareness from many people about issues like how space can relate to power, how space can be oppressive or space can be liberative. These were things that I think were abstract for many people that aren't abstract anymore. And that gives our students an opportunity to maybe finally make some progress in kind of talking about why design matters for our culture. I think that's always been a really difficult thing that we've struggled with. And I do think it's maybe a new moment. I think the world that the students are walking out into is even more changed than this world we've been talking about today within our schools.
So I would like to use Renee's word porous and Nan's integration. I think moving forward for architecture students, I do believe that they need to collaborate with landscape architects, that our buildings need to be porous. They need to be integrated with the outdoors. I remember when COVID hit, we were in spring break. So after a week, we would have to come back. And I told the president, look, Dr. Wilson, let us do an analysis of outdoor spaces where students can actually have their learning environments there. We couldn't find a lot of outdoor spaces. I know other universities had the resources to have tents. We didn't have that. And so we went indoor. Okay, maybe not outdoor, let's go indoor. And obviously the first solution that designers came up with were those plastic, how do you say this, partitions, right? And we found out health-wise, they never work really. Germs can, so in other words, either outdoor or indoor, we really need to integrate landscape and building more. And I think helping our students learn that as we move forward is critical to their future.
Thank you. So Caitlin is going to break in here, and I want to take this opportunity to thank all the panelists and for this great conversation. Hopefully it won't stop here. My last thing for everyone, including the audience, to think about is how do we take this great conversation that we've heard and actually nudge the profession into some of these, into Nan's thoughts about integration, these overlap spaces, that we don't get stuck in the silos or within these boundaries, because the interesting things and the things that really need to happen are in those interstitial spaces at this point. So thank you all very much. And I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin so she can wrap us up.
Thank you so much. I'm inelegantly trying to share my screen here due to many things at once. Again, I wanted to echo the profound thanks again to our panelists and to Lynn for leading this conversation, and for everyone who joined us today. A friendly reminder that we do have another conversation coming up in May. Registration details are on the screen, and we also will be sending these details to anyone who registered for today's session. So please be on the lookout for that. And just a reminder that this conversation, as well as all the other past conversations hosted by the EUI, are available on our website as well as our YouTube channel. So please do check out those resources, and please do join us for future conversations. With that, we want to say goodbye and thank you once again, everyone, for making this event possible today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.